of a couple of genocide scholars who asserted a continuity between colonial genocides and the Nazi genocide, between racism and anti-Semitism. One of the main protagonists in this debate was Jürgen Zimmerer, who I think is on the list of potential speakers for this series as well, who in 2011 published a book entitled From Windhoek to Auschwitz, highlighting this line of continuity between colonialism and the Nazi genocide, particularly the German colonial wars and the genocide against the Nama and the Herero in 1904 to 1907. The debate gained impetus from the recognition that there are many migrants and refugees in Germany who have attained citizenship for whom the Holocaust is neither unique nor central. They come with their own memories of trauma, dispossession, expulsion, and exile. So there is no shared intergenerational memory of the Holocaust for a new generation of citizens living in Germany. Instead, migrants and refugees bring their own experiences and perspectives that have to find recognition in public. This was taken up, or this was captured in a book by Michael Rothberg entitled Multidirectional Memory, which was published in 2009, but only translated into German in 2021 and caused one hell of a stir in Germany, predictably, I suppose. So the dominant memory culture in Germany up to that point did not include its historical role as colonial power. So there's guilt about the Holocaust, but not about colonialism and colonial genocides. There is no acknowledgement of Israel as a colonial regime, and there's a denial and sanctioning of Palestinian perspectives on Israel as colonial occupying power. Now, it was Achille Mbembe who landed in the middle of this debacle, I think probably quite unsuspectingly at the time, in 2021. This second historians' debate caused a huge backlash that had its implications for government policy in Germany. So the reassertion of the uniqueness of the Holocaust as civilizational rupture was now attributed also to Hamas's attack on Israel of 7th of October. So the Holocaust and the 7th of October were being equated. It is the source of a notion of a special responsibility, so-called special responsibility, of the German state towards the state of Israel and towards Jews. Angela Merkel stated before the Knesset in 2008, Israel's security is Germany's reason of state. Now, this term, reason of state, is a very strange one to surface at this stage in the current German context. It is a concept taken from 16th and 17th century political thinkers, most notably Niccolo Machiavelli, and it entails that the state's interests trump considerations, trump legal and moral considerations of all other kinds. This statement, Israel's security is Germany's reason of state, was reiterated verbatim by Chancellor Olaf Scholz on the 12th of October last year in German parliament. So it moves right across the political spectrum, no matter whether it is the conservatives or the social democrats, they sing the same tune on this particular issue. Germany identifies with and supports Israel as its own path to redemption. German collective guilt having been atoned for through working through the past, and dominant memory culture is now understood to have been successfully completed. The dominant memory culture supposedly produces good post-Holocaust subjects. The Holocaust remembrance legitimizes the state of Israel and simultaneously expiates German guilt about the Nazi genocide, which is, I think, why it has attained such force in dominant memory culture in Germany, to the extent that it has become the official government line, which is now asserted against migrants and refugees. I would like to give you an example of what the German Minister of the Interior proposed as recently as April this year. The test of integratability of migrants and refugees as German citizens is to be amended with the following questions that are posed to aspiring German citizens. And I'd like to read you just some of those questions that are to be included in this citizenship test. What is the word for a Jewish place of worship? When was the State of Israel founded? Why does Germany carry a special responsibility for the State of Israel? That's not even in question. It presupposes its answer. What is the punishment for Holocaust denial? And who can become a member of Jewish Maccabi sports clubs? So these are the questions that migrants and refugees have to answer as part of their test that they have to pass in order to become German citizens. The dominant normative German memory culture has been challenged on a number of grounds. Firstly, by Palestinians themselves. They call into question Israel's role as credible witness to German making good gestures. That has also been called into question by the BDS, which was formed in 2005 and about which we're going to hear more. I think Noor and Joe are going to probably tell us more about the history of the BDS. Calling for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions against the Israeli government and those supporting it. In 2019, the German parliament took an anti-BDS resolution. It labeled the BDS anti-Semitic and as questioning the state of Israel's right to exist. So again, we have an equation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. This resolution has a strange status. It is not legally binding. It is simply an opinion taken on current events. Yet it led to the banning of Palestinian symbols, particularly the flags, the kufiyas, the banning of pro-Palestinian demonstrations and solidarity marches, and the banning of Nakba commemoration events. Now, I'd like to, having said something about the dominant German memory culture, I'd like to say something about the role of these historians' debates in the formation of this dominant memory culture. And I would not like to leave the second historians' debate completely out of account and out of criticism. So firstly, and these are my points of critique, and we can debate them when we come to discussion time. Firstly, both the historians' dispute continue to harp on the public role of the affect of shame and guilt. Speaking with Hannah Arendt, I would say collective guilt is a completely misplaced feeling. It's an expression of what our
Interesting until this one.
Gonna unmute.
So, sorry, everybody, we had a technical issue. We've just had to change laptop. Something is wrong with our connection. Ulrike, you can carry on.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
once we get
you.
I think that's you there, isn't it?
Yeah.
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 Okay, shall I? Okay. So I was busy trying to formulate my criticisms of the more progressive version of the historians' debate, or supposedly more progressive version. And the criticism that I have is that it constructs a one-directional vector from colonialism, from colonial genocide to the Holocaust, from Windhoek to Auschwitz, as if colonialism would be the precursor and Auschwitz would be the consequent, the destination. By and large, it does not consider this vector in the reverse direction, namely from the Holocaust to settler colonialism, from the Holocaust to the Nakba. It does not consider the role, paralleled in the German case, of the Holocaust as a foundation myth of the State of Israel and the legitimation of the policies of the State of Israel as colonial and occupying regime. And I think that's where we come to our concerns that exercise our solidarity and our political action at the moment. So with that in mind, I would say we would need to shift away from the German national tunnel vision on 20th century history and commemorative culture to include developments in the Palestinian diaspora in the context of a global history of solidarity movements, which is the very well-chosen topic that Bettina has prefaced this event with. But before I go into that and look at the history of this of Palestinian solidarity, I would like to make reference to a little personal anecdote. This kefir is not a recent acquisition. It is 55 years old. I acquired it when I went to do my high schooling in Germany, starting in 1967. And I think I probably got it when I was in grade 8 or 9 in 1968. That is how broad-based the Palestinian solidarity movement was in Germany, which is what public memory culture in Germany has conveniently forgotten and which never surfaces in these debates. There was a broad-based Palestinian solidarity movement to the extent that Palestine became the paradigmatic case for all anti-colonial struggles and solidarity movements. Down into the schools, as I say, I was in grade 8 or 9. So we went on marches, rallies, we went to school. This is well worn through all of those years, and I brought it with me when I came back to South Africa. But in order to unearth this history even further, we would have to look at how it came to be that Palestinian mobilization took off in Germany. In the 1960s, Arab-speaking Palestinian refugees arrived in Germany. They were born largely in the former British Mandate for Palestine, and they were often registered as Jordanian Arabs. They came to Germany mostly as students and labor migrants. But in the absence of a migration treaty between Germany and Jordan, Palestinian labor migrants found themselves in a legal limbo because as Palestinians, they were stateless. They did not get work permits. They were considered illegal workers. They did not feature in any official statistics. Palestinian workers and students, however, made common cause. They lived together in public housing, and Palestinian students often worked to earn their living. They often worked in factories and on construction sites along their compatriot workers. Frankfurt, Berlin, and Heidelberg became centers of Palestinian political mobilization between 1959 and 1964. An Arab student union that coordinated its activities across Europe was formed in Munich. Fatah sections emerged in Frankfurt and Heidelberg. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a more radical grouping, was based mainly in West Berlin. The Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine was based mainly in Heidelberg. They had become disillusioned with pan-Arabism, fearing that a settlement between Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Israel would sideline Palestinians. So that is how the links came about that were forged with then so-called Third World liberation movements and with Algerian, Chinese, and Cuban governments. They were strengthened during and after the Six-Day War of 1967, and they merged with solidarity movements across the West German left, which really got going in 1967, 1968, which is when this CAFIA dates from. This marked a shift in the German left, which had up to that point thrown its weight behind the support for the state of Israel. So with Palestinian solidarity movements merging with the German protests, the Palestinian cause really became, well, attained a public role. The Palestinian struggle became paradigmatic of anti-colonial struggles internationally in Nicaragua, Cuba, Vietnam, Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa. And I think the poster that you've chosen for this event, Bettina, the poster designed by Kamal Bulata, speaks to that. It was printed in 1968. Kamal Bulata died in Berlin. He lived in West Berlin. He was a fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg. He lived in Berlin for the last years of his life. He died in Berlin in 2019. So again, an indication of the strong presence of Palestinian diaspora in Germany. The keffiyeh as a symbol of solidarity in anti-colonial struggles was traditionally associated with rural workers and Bedouins in Palestine. And it was worn especially after the 1967, well, after the Nakba, and this establishment of the State of Israel, and then once again after the Six-Day War in 1967, when the Palestinian flag was prohibited. That is when Israel became an occupying power. So the keffiyeh was the one way of expressing solidarity with the Palestinian cause. However, the solidarity with Palestine, the German solidarity, West German left solidarity with Palestine, declined in the 1970s. After 1970, the West German student movement splintered, which saw Israel in cahoots with Germany and the US as imperial powers, took on the German state head on. And it was particularly Maoist groups and the Red Army fraction that confronted the West German state directly. Parallel to that, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the more radical wing based in West Berlin, became more radicalized. They were involved in attacks on an El Al flight at Munich airport, and then very infamously, an attack on the Israeli Olympic team in Munich in the summer of 1972. So there was an outcry about so-called Palestinian terrorists. Citizens from Arab states were deported from Germany en masse. The General Union of Palestinian Students and the General Union of Palestinian Workers were prohibited. And this marked the decline of support for the Palestinian struggles, both in Germany and in the Middle East. By the end of the 1970s, there was the interest in so-called third world struggles had faded, but simultaneously, Palestinian interests in alliances with leftists in Western Europe were also fading, especially during and after the Lebanese war. So after the heyday of decolonization, the limits of solidarity became apparent. Palestinians were cast as Arabs, foreigners, terrorists, Islamic fundamentalists. So I would say in conclusion, to quote a historian, Palestinians have served as a projection screen for the changing fates and preferences of the West European left, which in turn were related to continuities and breaks in German history. The history of the Palestinian cause in Germany was as much part of a history of solidarity with anti-colonial struggles as it was the result of violent nation-state formation, expulsion, and statelessness that still resonates in both Israeli and German policies. So I'd like to end on this rather unsatisfactory note. I think the developments in Israel and in Palestine are quite parallel to each other with regard to the Palestinian struggle. So while Germany, I think this is part of a way of addressing that question. Thank you.
Thanks, Ulrike.
Joe first.
To over again, if you remember.
This is working.
It is.
Okay. Yes.
Apologies for the technical hiccup in the middle. I lost connection on my laptop and we had to change over, but all sorted. Thanks for bearing with us and staying with us. Thanks to Ulrike for an incredible kind of analysis of a very broad sweep of history, not very easy to do in such a short time. And our next speaker is Joe Bluen, who is a socio-legal historian working on the nexus of apartheid, racial capitalism, and colonial genocide in international law, currently finishing a PhD in international relations at the LSE in London and lecturing in sociology at the University of Cape Town. They organized with South African Jews for a free Palestine, which we misnamed slightly in our advertising. Apologies for that. But Joe is speaking to us from Cape Town, so hopefully we have no technical issues. Joe, I'm going to mute myself and that you take over as speaker. So just shout if there's anything going wrong.
Hi, can you hear me? Is that working? Yes? Okay, great. Thank you. Good evening,
Joe,
everyone.
are you muted? Joe, I think you just check if you're muted or not.
Can you hear me? No? Yes. Okay. Good evening, everyone, comrades, friends, colleagues. It's really an honor and a sad, ragey honor to be here this evening. And my gratitude to the organizers and everyone whose labor has gone into bringing us together this evening. I'm also very grateful to Ulrike for that amazing span of the German historiographical debates, which I think are so deeply connected to so much of what I want to say, and so deeply connected to how I've been thinking recently on the questions of anti-colonial, anti-apartheid, and anti-genocide solidarity. We are here in South Africa, some of us, just to the south of Namibia, where, of course, the genocide of the Ovo Herero and Nama people forms a kind of colonial thread that is often effaced from the story of German colonial genocide, which of course begins with the Berlin Conference and spans way back into German imperial projects across the globe. In preparation for this evening, as I've been meandering through bits of archival notes and materials around colonial genocide, war, and the unhumaning racial capitalist project of apartheid globalized, and the epochal and quotidian forms of collective resistance to it, I've been thinking about what it means to think transhistorically and transnationally, and what the role of history is in thinking about our anti-colonial movements and moments. I've been thinking about the ghosts of the archives that haunt us, and I've been thinking about the links between history and the future, and our futuristic imaginations of what liberation for all might look like. I draw here a little bit on one of our preeminent genocide scholars, Zoe Samudzi, who calls for thinking in terms of reparative futurities. Samudzi writes, reparations discourses articulate a grammar of futurity, not simply because a world that does not exist, not simply a world that does not exist, but one that could be fabricated through attempts to repair historical harm and trauma. The imagining of hypotheticals, the meaningful address of genocidal harm, always demands an ontological shift, because the world that accommodates a reparation, a wound remedy by an aggrieved party, is not a world that presently exists. It is one that has to be created. So this is kind of a starting point from which I want to move, and I'm thinking a lot in keeping with this this wonderful brief that we've been given by Comrade Bettina around silence and silencing. We exist, I think those of us who are in the academy or who are doing activist work outside of Palestine and inside of Palestine, we exist adjacent to a terrain of war. And we often talk about the discursive terrain, and I'm interested in how we might understand the terrain of the discourse and the discourse of the terrain. And central to this is silence. So historian Michel Rolf Trouillot says, any historical narrative is a bundle of silences. Hazel Carby writes, history is written by the victors, but it takes a careful regime of silencing to retain its hold on the present and the future. So when I think about the ways in which institutions in Germany and also in South Africa and globally are trying to silence anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian solidarity, or indeed any form of anti-racist, anti-queer, anti-feminist solidarity and speech, I'm thinking of this a lot in part as a moment of silencing resistance that mimics the criminalization of resistance that we see in global politics, but also a moment to produce an historical archive wherein the resistance that always has been there is silenced. And I think so kind of picking up from where Ulrike left off, I think one of the key moments is that International Historical Alliance, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and the particular definition of anti-Semitism that we get there. And it is, of course, a deeply ahistorical definition that serves nothing for Jewish people, but rather is a deeply colonial, deeply racist, deeply silencing notion of anti-Semitism. I'm going to read it briefly. It says, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Now, anyone who knows a little bit of history will see the absolute flaw in this understanding of anti-Semitism. If we go back to colonial modernity, the start with 1492, we go back to the Spanish Inquisition, we know that it is a moment in history where anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-feminist thought all kind of coalesces through the work of history, of science, of biology, of pseudoscience, to produce a global contract that is what I am thinking with Robin Kelly as a fascist nightmare, wherein we see this global project of colonial subjugation, of which anti-Semitism is a part. So I'd like to sort of start from this point and say, how do we remember the Holocaust? If the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is about Holocaust remembrance, how do we remember it? I'd like to sort of start with a personal anecdote. Comrade Bettina asked me to speak a bit personally and say, so I am. My ancestors are Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, most of whom lived in the shtetls and ghettos of Eastern Europe, and many of them were watchmakers. There's a story that my grandmother tells about how one of the uncles had a large rabbinical beard, and he used to come home from the watch shop with pieces and springs from watches, which I've started to think about as kind of fragments of time, and coming back to the question of remembering history. Our narratives of these neat kind of origin stories and linear histories, particularly which give rise to the idea that the existence of the Nazi Holocaust in Europe necessitates the existence of a fascist genocidal state in Palestine, operates through a series of mythologies that forget that time doesn't operate in a linear fashion, that itself is a colonial invention. And I think one of the key things here that is absent from the discourse on how Zionism and Judaism are conflated, is that the Nazi Holocaust in Europe was a racial genocide, and so much of our historicism about it reframes that as a kind of an act of belligerent aggression, which it was as well. One of the things I was reading recently is about how at Nuremberg, there was such a reticence by American prosecutors specifically to look at the racial components, wherein Jews and many others were set up as lesser humans, precisely because of the lynching and the anti-Blackness and the white supremacy that was and remains the foundation of US society. And I think one of the things that is so crucial here is looking at kind of the world order that has come out of this contract, this German memory contract that has produced in many ways this world order, is that there was, I mean, I'm going back to the 40s now, to think about the San Francisco Conference, which came in the aftermath of the Second World War, where state representatives got together to deliberate over what a kind of new world order would look like. And I just want to read briefly from it was called a Declaration to the Nations of the World, sent by the ANC's Puma to San Francisco. And it says, "The peoples of the world who were horrified by the inhuman record of Nazism may be aware of the fact that the non-Europeans of South Africa live and suffer under a tyranny very little different from Nazism. Lest it may seem that people far removed from South Africa that this comparison is either an exaggeration or a figurative expression, we shall demonstrate in more concrete form how closely the life form of a non-European in South Africa is akin to the suffering of Nazi tyranny." I think this is key because I think what it says to me is that this idea that anti-Semitism is an exceptional form of racism or of subjugation is ahistorical and very much can be accredited not only to the kind of Nazi pact, but also to the historical debates that have come after it. In Tina Kamp's The Other Germans, she writes about anti-Blackness as a foundational understanding of the Nazi Holocaust, that the idea of racism, that the Jews and the idea of Lebensraum was very much similar to the settler colonial pact that shaped what happened in Namibia. And so this idea of anti-Semitism being some kind of exception is ahistorical and doesn't really accord with any real understanding of what it is. And I think one of the things that I've been grappling with is, surely this is known, surely this must be known, and why do we have to keep coming back and saying anti-Semitism is not anti-Zionism, Judaism is not Zionism, when we are at a stage where this has been patent for so very long. And I sort of bringing this into the present. Today, I saw a headline with the indictment, the applications for arrest of Netanyahu and others, of Netanyahu describing the ICC as anti-Semitic for prosecuting genocide. And again, this idea that genocide is a uniquely, that the idea of genocide must be something uniquely about Jews, and it is a corruption both of Judaism and of history. So in thinking kind of transnationally and transhistorically about solidarities, one of the things that occurs to me is that if we're understanding that these forms of fascism, that these forms of colonial genocide, that these structures are connected, so too must we understand that our resistance to it should be as well. I was reading, so Maya Cable has written a fantastic essay on compulsory Zionism. And basically the idea there takes us back to Europe, where Zionism was a deeply anti-Semitic project and was obviously there as a discourse that was a means of getting rid of Europe's Jews and placing them somewhere else. It was a displacement project. And the kind of idea of the new anti-Semitism, wherein Zionism is somehow being seen as a safety position for the Jews, continues to perpetuate the colonial violence of racial capitalism and genocidal modernity. To kind of bring us back into the South African context and to think about these connected fascisms and racisms in more concrete terms, and also the relationships between knowledge and war, and apartheid and genocide. Mendel Kaplan, who was the billionaire philanthropist who headed up Cape Gate and also the Kaplan Center at UCT and many other, the Israel Center, was part of, in the 70s, was part of a massive South African, headed up a massive South African sponsorship contingent together with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which was an archaeology project, essentially looking at ways to show excavations of real or imagined Jewish artifacts in support of a kind of cultural arsenal to support the false mythology that Palestine was a land of no people for a country with no, for a land of no people for a country with no land. And this, it resulted in what was the City of David project, where, people, this is the kind of, people can go on a kind of Indiana Jones type safari and do excavation projects, which are fundamental to building the mythos of Zionism. Some years later, Cape Gate, through one of its subsidiaries, provided the barbed wire not only for oppression of South Africans, but also for the apartheid wall in Palestine and the walls, the fence surrounding Gaza at the moment. So I think I'd like to sort of, I guess what I have more questions than answers, but what I'd like to sort of sit with is how these forms of violence, of genocidal violence, of Zionist capture of the imagination, of racial capitalist dispossession, of settler colonial internationalism are connected, and how they are connected through our knowledge institutions, through our resistance too. I'd like to sort of spend more time in the discussion talking about this, but to end with a quote, thinking about solidarities and what we might imagine as different futurities, from Assata Shakur, who says, "A wall is just a wall and nothing more at all." Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think we have somebody's mic on. I have tried to mute the offending mic, but it keeps coming back. Now I can't seem to find it. But thank you very, very much, Joe. I can still hear the mic. I'm not sure. Someone's cooking. Someone in the audience said someone is cooking or fencing. We're not sure which they're doing, but if you could all just kindly check that your mics are off, that would be really helpful for us. And I'm going to.
We know what it is, Mike.
It's Michael. Where? There. Yeah. True. Michael Byers, sorry, I don't. Your mic seems to come on and off occasionally. And just if you could check that it stays off, thank you. It appears to be off now, but yeah. So I'm going to introduce our last speaker in discussion today, and then we'll obviously switch over to questions, which you're welcome to type. Michael, we're going to have to, Michael's perhaps taking a bath of some kind. It's just very strange because I mute this microphone and then it seems to come back. I'm not really sure why. Let me see what is going on. Oh, Michael's returning. Okay. All right. Perhaps it was a technical issue. So our last speaker today is Noor, who is Noor is Noor Nieftagodien is the NRF South African Chair in Local Histories. He's currently head of the History Workshop at Wits University, and has written several books around local histories in Johannesburg and surrounding townships. Noor is also part of the Congress of South Africans, is researching a history of the Congress of South African Students, and is co-editor of a book called Labor Struggles in Southern Africa from 1919 to 1949. He serves on various boards, including the South African History Archive, Alternative Information Development Center, and the Socioeconomics Rights Institute, SERI, and recently spoke at the Global Apartheid Conference, which happened in Johannesburg last week, which was also intervened with and shut down, not shut down, but intervened with by sort of strange Zionist intervention outside the conference. Noor, we're going to hand over to you. I'm just going to change over here. Thank you.
All right, very much, Bettina. I think that people can hear and see me, isn't it? Okay, yes, fantastic, super. All right, in thinking about what to say to this audience, kind of recognizing that there are two audiences. There's a South African audience and there's an international audience. I thought that what I should do is offer some fragmented reflections on international solidarity and the BDS campaign in particular. I'm very aware of the time. So Bettina, if you could around 10 minutes kind of wave at me, and then I'll try to kind of draw things to a conclusion. My starting point is really to assert a position that I think most people, if not everyone, in this meeting will share, and that is the importance and centrality of international solidarity as a constitutive part of emancipatory politics. And there's a long history of global solidarity and of internationalism. The anti-slavery movement, for example, was critical in constituting the idea of international solidarity. And in the 20th century, movements against war were especially important. And because we're talking of Germany, the First World War was a key moment in constituting international solidarity against imperialist wars. And of course, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht were murdered for their principled stand of international solidarity against the wars of imperialism. And I make this point because it may be self-evident, but it is for me an important starting point. And I would say that in the 20th century, particularly the second half of the 20th century, workers and students have constituted perhaps the most consistent social forces that have enacted various forms of international solidarity through the organizations and through the movements. And for me, this is important because when one thinks of international solidarity, I want to assert at the beginning that the work of ordinary people, of the working class, of Black people, of women, of students, have always been at the center of constituting international solidarity and international movements. More recently, indigenous societies have asserted themselves increasingly powerfully as key nodes of international solidarity. Now, I'm also making that point because I want to come back to the conference that Bettina referenced, which took place in Johannesburg just a week ago, the Global Anti-Apartheid Conference, which is an attempt by movements across the world, heeding the call of Palestinians to constitute a new anti-apartheid movement, focused on apartheid Israel, the settler colonial society, for the freedom of Palestinian people. And the connection there, of course, is to try and resurrect the kind of international movement, international anti-apartheid movement that contributed significantly to the struggle against apartheid. And I think this is really fundamentally important. And there is the possibility in constituting such a new anti-apartheid movement of galvanizing forces internationally around a kind of common platform, which has not really materialized in the waves of solidarity that have taken place over many decades. And I think it's been really, for me, important to learn from Ulrike, the development of Palestinian solidarity in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, which I certainly wasn't aware of in relation to Germany. But I want to introduce a complication and then kind of talk about some of in relation to South Africa historically and bring it back to the present. In this conference that took place last week, there were some wonderful things that happened. First of all, South Africa is the darling of the world when it comes to international solidarity, especially in relation to Palestine. And I've said to people before, I was in Europe at the beginning of the year, and participating in marches. And when people heard that I was from South Africa, I was so warmly embraced and kind of celebrated. And it was slightly disconcerting because I'd not experienced this kind of warmth and solidarity and celebration of South Africa since the early and mid-1990s, when one traveled anywhere in the world, the first thing people would say is Mandela. Okay, and then for like 2 minutes, they would say Bafana, Bafana. That was in 1996. And since then, the kind of sense that South Africa may be at the center of the development of international solidarity has waned considerably. And South Africa has re-emerged in the last 7 months as the kind of pivot around which solidarity for Palestine is emerging. But here's a complication for me. In this conference, in addition to the routine celebration of South Africa's role, and in particular South African government, when Naledi Pandor spoke as the keynote speaker, she was sort of celebrated not as the Minister of International Relations in South Africa, but as the Minister of Palestine. And everyone kind of erupted in applause, celebrating the principal position which she has taken, and the way that she has, in fact, dragged the South African government to consistently be in support of Palestine. And yet, there was a thread that ran through the conference that went something like this. The anti-apartheid movement in the 1970s and 1980s was part of the South African liberation struggle, which had 4 pillars. And I'm going to in shorthand, and then the people who are not familiar with this history can ask me more during the question time. And the 4 pillars, in fact, emerge out of an ANC history that came about in the late 1970s when the ANC in exile went to Vietnam, and they returned from Vietnam and recalibrated the kind of framework of the South African liberation struggle as comprising 4 pillars. And the international solidarity was the 4th pillar in the anti-apartheid struggle. Now, what happened in the conference was that everyone who spoke invoked the idea of 4 pillars, including the Palestinians. And what emerged there was the development of a model for the Palestinian struggle based on South Africa's struggle. And so keynote speakers and other people who intervened spoke as if this kind of our international solidarity, now framed as 4 pillars, and of course South Africa in the 1990s was regarded as the kind of blueprint for negotiations, for how one produces a negotiated settlement. And so this idea re-emerged in this conference as a possible model for what could happen in Palestine. That if Palestinians adopted the idea of 4 pillars, then there is a roadmap towards negotiations, and then the possibility of some configuration of a free Palestine. Now, I'm raising this kind of question because I became quite disturbed during the conference. On the one hand, there was this kind of celebration of South Africa's international solidarity, but the way that it was being framed, South Africa not only being in the forefront of international solidarity, but also providing the blueprint for what should happen in Palestine. Now, I'm going to come back to this towards the end, and please tell me when I've done 10 minutes because I'm incapable of keeping time. So what about the anti-apartheid movement? And I want to raise just 2 or 3 things and try and demonstrate some of the complications that emerge in this anti-apartheid movement that is regarded as the blueprint for international solidarity that Palestinians must now adopt. And of course, what it ignores, and I want to draw again on what Ulrike says, it almost erases decades of Palestinian solidarity on their own terms across the world. Okay, that this sort of now being posed on the international solidarity for Palestinians. The global anti-apartheid movement was undoubtedly one of the key expressions of international solidarity, and in fact predominated in the 1970s, but particularly in the 1980s. But this anti-apartheid movement was not without complications. And there's no time now. I was hoping to give a kind of 5-minute talk about the evolution of the anti-apartheid movement, starting, in fact, from the sports boycotts in the 1960s and 1970s, which shaped the nature of the anti-apartheid movement and, in fact, constituted the foundation on which ideas of BDS emerged. The success of the sport boycott, kicking South Africa out of the International Olympic Committee, out of various other sporting codes, and especially cricket and rugby, created the template for BDS that emerged in the context of South Africa in the 1980s. Now, some of the complications that I want to raise, just to try and kind of raise some questions for discussion. The anti-apartheid movement itself, the success of the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s tends to marginalize and erase some of the internal debates that occurred in the anti-apartheid movement. The first one was simply this, that the anti-apartheid movement became a part of the 4 pillars and under control of the ANC. And dissenting voices, dissenting movements were marginalized in that process. To give one example, in the early 1980s, when there was the miners' strike in the UK, mine workers in South Africa and their new union, which was established in the early 1980s, called the National Union of Mine Workers, whose key figure, some of you will know, his name is Cyril Ramaphosa, wanted to organize direct links and direct solidarity between mine workers in South Africa and mine workers in Britain. There was this long strike against Thatcher's closing of the coal mines in Britain. And the anti-apartheid movement with the ANC rejected this kind of solidarity. In fact, the Communist Party, South African Communist Party, until 1983, referred to trade unions in South Africa as yellow unions. And they had a slogan which said, direct links stink, meaning that direct links between workers in South Africa wanting to organize solidarity with workers in Britain could not happen. Direct links couldn't happen. That links between struggling workers in South Africa and struggling workers in the UK should only happen via the anti-apartheid movement, via the ANC. So there was this kind of tight control of what the anti-apartheid movement should mean. What that meant was that the idea of the 4 pillars, the idea of the anti-apartheid movement, which came it was hugely successful, okay? But one must not lose sight of the internal political contestations, the internal debates and internal struggles that took place in constituting the anti-apartheid movement, notwithstanding its important successes. I happen to, because we're all having to do personal anecdotes, okay? I happened to visit the UK in the late 1980s and participated in various kind of campaigns there. And I was struck by 2 seemingly contradictory things. The first was that in the UK, there were many other solidarity movements, right? Like for Chile, Sri Lanka, etc., etc. But what tended to happen was that the anti-apartheid movement elbowed out these other solidarity movements. They kind of operated on the margins. And even though when there were marches, these solidarity movements combined. But my strong sense as a South African was that these other movements were having to fight over the crumbs of international solidarity. And I'm raising that here because, as we all know, one of the key debates taking place within universities is what about other countries that are facing crises? That there's a sense now that those of us who are prioritizing and focusing on the genocide unfolding in Gaza and mobilizing Palestinian solidarity, we are being accused of not caring for other countries where there are crises, particularly on the African continent. Sudan, the DRC are normally the examples that are mobilized. I do want to move on to a key example in the late 1980s, mid-1980s, 1986 to be precise, that shaped solidarity at universities in South Africa. When I look around the room here, I can see only one other person who might remember this, okay? And it centered around someone called Conor Cruz O'Brien, okay? Who, an Irish scholar who visited South Africa. He was a strong opponent of boycotts, of academic boycotts. And Conor Cruz O'Brien arrived in South Africa in 1986 to visit Wits University and UCT. And there was an eruption, a big debate about academic freedom. And Conor Cruz O'Brien was quite right-wing, okay? In fact, at UCT, which is where I was at the time, he was invited by the Kaplan Jewish Center to speak, right, against academic boycotts. And this was a key moment in which the role of universities, the role of academic freedom in international solidarity, in boycotting campaign, came to a head. And in fact, what happened at those two universities is that students protested. They didn't allow Conor Cruz O'Brien to speak. I was part of a big demonstration at the UCT where he spoke and we just kind of shouted him down. At Wits University, I only discovered about 30 odd years later that it led to a resolution being passed at Wits University, for those of you who want to know, that celebrated protests and said that protests should be guaranteed. So even when, and recognized that protests were disruptive. This was in fact the outcome of this Conor Cruz O'Brien protest at UCT. But there was another example which I want to bring to the table, and it concerns the late leader of SWAP, Eddie Webster, who was a key figure, a key intellectual in the trade unions, and who went on a tour, an academic tour in the UK. And in fact, he was booed, okay? And he was told that you can't, that we are boycotting universities in South Africa and all scholars who come from universities in South Africa. And here was someone who from the 1960s and especially from the 1970s played an important role, influential role in the evolving independent trade unions. I'm making those 2 points because the idea of international solidarity as it emerged in South Africa raised important debates which we should return to in thinking about how we prosecute international solidarity in support of the Palestinians, but also in support of other movements. I'm going to make 2 or 3 points, finally. I should say I'm only halfway through my talk, but I'm going to summarize, some of the points I want to make. And let me start here. Some of you will know, and our international guests may not know, that last week there was an encampment by our students at this university for about 7 to 10 days. And I'm not going to kind of summarize it. I think it was a wonderful expression of international solidarity. But there was an important debate that emerged out of that. It emerged from some Fees Must Fall students who were key figures in 2015 and 2016 and 17. And one of the critiques that some of these Fees Must Fall students raised, and this happened at Wits and at UCT, was that our students who were creating an encampment at Wits and then again at UCT were mimicking the encampments at United States universities. And how can you do that, okay? South Africa has experiences of kind of protests and encampments, We shouldn't, in the global south, mimic what happens in the global north, in particular the United States. Now, I found this very surprising for many, many reasons. The first one gave me an enormous amount of pleasure because it allowed me to say to the Feast Must Fall generation, you are now the old people in protest. And when you criticize us in 2015, 2016 of not understanding you, we told you that at some point in life, we'll be able to tell you, we told you so. But it raised an important point about, this kind of solidarity. Because it seemed to me that what the students were doing last week at Wits and at UCT is that they were, in fact, quite true to international solidarity. They were not mimicking what was happening in the US. They were, in fact, offering solidarity with students in the US who were coming under severe attack by the police, by the university administrations for their solidarity with Palestinian people and against the genocide. So our students were organizing real solidarity, both with university students in the United States, but also with Palestinians, with Palestinian people. Now, the final point I want to make, because I can see, Bettina, you are coming closer to me to tell me to kind of keep quiet. I want to end up on this point. The students at our university and across the country and across the world have stand in contrast to what is the politics in the university leadership. And I want to link it to the first point I made about the kind of South African government and where we stand. Because it's a sense across the world that because the South African government has taken Israel to the ICJ and has made a strong claim about genocide, that solidarity for Palestinian people is the norm in South Africa. It's not the case. There are a couple of fundamental problems, and I'll take it from the vantage point of what is happening in our universities. In our Senate, 2 Senate meetings, there were a couple of key arguments that were made against international solidarity, which the students campaigned against in their campaign, and then I'll end. The 2 arguments were the following. One, that Palestine is far away, that we need to concern ourselves with local issues. In fact, one senator in our meeting said, we can only pass a resolution on international matters if it affects the functioning of our university directly. Any other form of solidarity should not be contemplated. The second and more important issue is that there is politically speaking, the key problem that we face in South Africa is Christian Zionism. And there's a strong belief amongst a large section of our population that the Israeli state is a good state, that it forms part of people's biblical beliefs, okay? And it's very difficult to make the argument against that. So our international solidarity, and this is particularly important in relation to organizing international solidarity, not only in South Africa, but also across the African continent. So our students' encampment was fabulous. It raised the importance of international solidarity, but it also demonstrated just how weak our actual international solidarity is. Because that encampment never grew, to more than 20, 30 people, okay? And the profile of the people there spoke volumes of how difficult it is to organize international solidarity amongst ordinary South Africans. There simply isn't the politics that we assume because of the role that South African government has played, simply does not exist among the majority of South Africans, and therefore we have quite a lot of work to do. But I'm going to end there. Thank you. Sorry for taking longer than the thing.
Thank you, Noor. That was fascinating and really interesting. I think maybe insight for international audiences into our particular relationship to apartheid and international solidarity historically and in the present. So thanks everyone who stayed with us, and I'm hoping that there's some questions in the chat. how are you? Please post your questions in the chat or put your hand up, and you can speak directly into the room that we're in physically here, and that might be really nice. How about we could also start with some questions, obviously, from within our speakers, and if Joe would like to perhaps come back in. It feels like we lost a few people. Hi, Joe.
Hi, sorry, I had a bit of a problem with my camera there.
Would you like, I am struggling to read my screen. I have a kind of a strange spatial thing that happened because of the Zoom. Yeah, we have also somebody trying to get back into the meeting, so I will sort that out. Yeah, would you like to ask a question, or are there any questions in the room? I definitely have, I think, some responses for myself, Ulrike and Noor, but I'd like to actually hear from other people in the room with us now, if anybody has any thoughts or questions they would like to share. And yes.
I have a question that
Yeah, I'm trying to think of this here.
Thank you. I have a question which has to do with what Ulrike said about the questions of shame and guilt by Germany. I find that interesting because I'm quite fascinated by what could be the origins of this shame and guilt, and is it real, or is it something that could have evolved over the years since the genocide, and where does it really come from? What are its roots?
Do we take Bettina? Do we take more questions? Or shall we address each one individually?
I think we could maybe start with that question.
Oh, sorry. I also had a question for Joe.
How is the sound now?
Yes, I also had a question for you, Joe. You said history is written by victors, and I found that interesting because I would think I would imagine a phrase like history is written by survivors. So there was kind of a going on in my head that maybe you differentiating between victors and survivors, and probably survivors, the word survivor could have undertones of victims. So I would just like you to comment or expand on that. Thank you.
Okay, that's a tall order of a question, but nevertheless a very pertinent one. I think that the emergence of guilt and shame in German memory culture was not there right after the war. In fact, it only emerged in the 1960s, and I think that's where the student protests played a huge part. They were asking the generation of their parents, their teachers, their professors, their bosses, where were you? Where were you when this happened? And in conjunction with the anti-fascist protests and the solidarity movements against colonialism elsewhere in the world, this question really came to the fore. And so the older generation, the generation that had participated in or experienced or benefited from the Nazi genocide and the pervasive ideology and public policies during the Nazi era, really felt themselves compelled to respond one way or the other. So I think that is, so the shame and the guilt emerged, I would say, only about 20 years later. And I think a similar process happened in Israel. The Holocaust survivors did not find a ready public in the formation of the State of Israel. In fact, they were disdained. Ben-Gurion said, we don't know what to do with this human debris about the survivors who came to Israel. We don't know what to do with this human debris. They're too damaged. So there was a silence that was cloaking the memory of the survivors. And it was only much later, particularly with the formation of the Likud Party, I think in the 1960s, that the Holocaust became the foundational myth of the State of Israel. So these were parallel processes. And then the German guilt sought to make amends in relation to the State of Israel, and the State of Israel sought recognition for the suffering of the victims through German reparations and through German confessions of guilt. Now, so I think these were mutually reinforcing processes. Now, in citing Hannah Arendt and her take on guilt, I mean, she's very, I think this comes out of her debate with Karl Jaspers, who did hold onto a notion of collective guilt. But Hannah Arendt would say, collective guilt is narcissistic, self-indulgent. Guilt, whether subjectively felt or objectively incurred as culpability, can only be individual. In fact, what we have to work towards is collective responsibility, universal responsibility, and that finds its political expression in solidarity. So that is how she distinguished guilt and responsibility. About shame, I'm personally a little bit ambivalent. I think shame could be considered a legitimate affect in public discourse, but that's a different debate. Okay.
There's a question from Abby, and then there's a question from Tirdad, which will be read out for us by Tasneem in the back of the room, who's controlling the other Zoom. So Abby, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Thanks for raising your hand.
Hi, good evening, comrades. My name is Abida, actually. I'm by no means an academic or a scholar. I work for a trade union, Gihusa, and we organize workers. We also organize workers who works at Clover, and the very big struggle that we have there with Malco, who's an Israeli company. But so I'm not too sure how these things happen, and but I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment, but it's with regards to Noor's input. There were a few things that he had mentioned, and I just so the one thing was about, how the Fallists were opposed to what they would call the encampment. I must say, Comrade Noor, I mean, I also, and there are quite a number of comrades of us who also had our reservations at the encampment. But I think it was more that we felt that, the students didn't mobilize and work enough with the university community. I went to the Wits students to the encampment there on probably 3 or 4 occasions last week. And for me, one of the things that was absent there, for example, was the workers' community. So I do believe there's a lot of work that they needed to do. The other thing also that I felt particularly strongly about was the language that was used. I mean, I think, yes, I agree with you that international solidarity is important, and the students needed to show that solidarity with the students, especially in the US, with regards to the encampment. But I had reservations in the sense that, it's about language and use of language. So, I mean, I felt that, if we had talked about the occupation, we would probably have had a bit. I don't know if that would have helped. There's a lot of other things. So I think also the language and in terms of the context that we are would also be important. And so maybe that was maybe one of the reasons why there were only 20 or 30 students that contributed to the reason. The other thing that you had raised, which I felt was really, really important, was the issue that we are confronted with a lot in South Africa in terms of solidarity with the Palestinian people. We are confronted a lot by was, what about the other struggles? Not just on the continent of Africa, but also with the struggles here of the working class, for example, especially in the Western Cape and the Cape Flats, where gangsterism and crime and those kind of things. So I want to link that to the Global Anti-Apartheid Conference. I have just not read the final declaration, but I think there we made an input, or we tried to make an intervention to say, as much as this Global Anti-Apartheid Conference and the declaration talks about the Palestinian people, that there should be some mention in terms of solidarity with other struggles, especially DRC, Sudan, Saharaui, etc. And I don't think that made it to the final declaration. So there are that kind of, I would think that things that, as much as we talk about solidarity for Palestinian people, that we shouldn't forget about the other struggles. And of course, if we call ourselves internationalists and we're doing this because we are anti-imperialists, that we should also raise those kind of issues. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Abby. I'm going to read out a question that kind of relates to that a little bit, which maybe goes back to some of the history Noor was relating to us, which comes from Tirdad Zolgeider, the initiator of these series of talks, Why Germany? Tirdad says, thank you so much for the amazing talks. Perhaps a question with regards to the boycott movement in South Africa. Would Noor argue that the said marginalization and conflicts were just a regular, inevitable part of a boycott movement? Or were they genuinely and concretely detrimental on some level? So perhaps Noor could, in a way, combine responses to Abby and to Tirdad.
So do you mind just reading that second one?
Yeah, so the question Tirdad was asking is, the said marginalizations and conflicts within the boycott movement, and I guess in relation to the South African struggle, were these regular or inevitable kinds of, things that happen in movements, or were they detrimental on some level?
Great, thanks. So, Abida, yeah, I think you raise important points. Look, my own view about this is, and this maybe has to do with kind of age and so on. I was most impressed by the fact that the people who were at the center of the encampment and the solidarity campaign at our university, they've been young women, I'd guess 18, 19-year-old. This is the first time that they've ever engaged in this kind of protest. And should be careful, those of us who've been around the block a few times, not to judge them too harshly. They learned enormously in the course of struggle. They understood that they should have done more military work. They tried to reach out to other groups of students. They had very little idea about the internal contestations within the student movements, for example. So 3-4 days into the protest, when they were confronted with divisions, ideological divisions, and fragmentations in student movements, they couldn't understand what was going on. So I'm a lot more sympathetic, and I think, of course, one needs to have a critical approach, and that's part of the kind of learning exercise in these movements. I think that there's an important argument that we have to grapple with about the kind of other struggles, other hardships that people confront beyond South Africa and in South Africa. We had a really fascinating group of activists from informal settlements in our various meetings, and they made the point very strongly about the need to ensure that their struggles can be connected to the solidarity movement that is taking shape around Palestine. Or to put it differently, that this kind of international solidarity shouldn't marginalize and eclipse their struggles as well. And for me, what was interesting in the way that they were formulating that is a real concern about trying to think politically about the intersections between the different struggles that go beyond the kind of generalizations, as important as they are, that the important connections in these struggles is global capitalism, imperialism. And those may be important, but they can be quite abstract as well. We need to, in the movements, think about how the international solidarity is in fact linked to what is happening in poor communities in South Africa and globally, but not in an artificial way. We need to do some of the hard work, the education, to ensure that the kind of marginalization that can occur does not occur. And these things don't happen through declarations. And so one of the things that didn't happen at the encampment consistently, and what international solidarity is also fundamentally about, as all struggles are schools, not in the kind of formal didactic sense, but people learn in struggle what are the issues that animate their own struggles and how those are taking place elsewhere, and what the connections are. So I would say that international solidarity as kind of forms of activism, but also, or rather simultaneously, forms of political emancipatory education. If those are done consistently, and keeping in mind that these are complicated issues that confront many difficulties, can mean that this kind of international solidarity does not have to be detrimental to other movements. And we need to find the connecting points. But those happen in struggle. And I can talk to you endlessly about the struggles are connected, but they need to be made meaningful in the context of particular struggles.
Do we have any more questions, or a sense that maybe we'd like to start to wrap up the conversation? One thought I was having was around the, I guess, when we're sort of seeing the student struggle here as a solidarity with solidarity, kind of an interesting, and I think this example you gave of the 80s miners' strike was a kind of similar playing field of solidarity with solidarity, with solidarity with a particular struggle, and I guess our solidarity here could extend to kind of friends and many of the people in the room in Zoom who have been facing their own struggles in Germany and in other contexts. How do we find a kind of a shared language? And I think what was nice about what Noor said is sometimes we force a language onto what are quite distinct political projects. And maybe at the base of them, there is a kind of anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist impulse, but it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution. And there's a sense that we need to find a language for solidarity as much as one that's very specific to each struggle's instantiation or articulation of the political. This is not a very easy thing to do. And I wonder if anyone in the audience, in the room or on Zoom, or the speakers, and Joe perhaps wants to come in here, would want to respond to that. Yeah, Joe, that would be great.
Should I just wanted to, I think these are really important questions, but I just wanted to respond to the question about history being written by the victors that someone in the room brought up. Thank you for that question. I think it's such an important one because I think history is a political project. And I mean, you have Comrade Noor in the room who can tell you all about this. And I think, so that was actually, it was a quote from Hazel Carby. And one of the things she was writing in response to this idea of the kind of founding mythology of the United States as, you know, the American dream, absenting the settler colonial genocide and histories of enslavement that kind of in whose afterlives the states and the world lives. So I absolutely agree with you in terms of who history should be written by. But very often, I think the kind of institutionalized project of history or memory is a political project and can't be dissociated from power. So what kinds of things are chosen as officialized history? That is very often a project of the victors. And very often, I think, and kind of drawing on the last comment from Abida and Noor as well, you know, who is not written into that history? Women, very often, queer people, Black people, working class people, trans people, and those stories are kind of erased. And very often, I think part of that, the survivors, but also those who resist. So, I mean, going back to the kind of German memory politic, so much of the history of partisans, of leftist thought in Eastern Europe, Bolshevik history, is written out of that history. So I think you're absolutely right that it should be written by survivors, and I think more and more there are formidable anti-colonial projects to think about history, or, you know, what was sometimes called histories from below or people's histories. But what I was referring to there is the very deeply colonial project of not only writing history, but using history as a means of control of a particular kind of narrative or mythology through which futures are foreclosed and predetermined, and ways of being in the world are kind of set to be continuous with really oppressive pasts.
Thanks, Joe. That was really interesting and maybe a good note on which to kind of start to conclude. We may continue the conversation here in the room. I finding the kind of dual hybrid nature of this not very easy for me to manage. Sorry about an earlier guest seemed to have not had their mic on and they were trying to come back in the room, but I wasn't completely able to kind of admit them again. So apologies to Michael Bears. I hope that the session has been a productive one and has brought into the picture, I think, some of the complexities of solidarity and international solidarity and the kind of histories and their, I guess, troubling some of the romanticization of some of those histories, and particularly the kind of exceptionalism and over-attention South Africans are receiving, which I think is we are finding quite strange when on the ground we confront some incredibly violent, you know, sort of oppression and repression, and sometimes in very personal spheres, where I think it's my turn to share an anecdote to end the evening, where I had a friend write to me to say, just before the encampment happened here, just to say that the encampment is happening at Wits. These are their demands. Is Bettina involved in this, which is not true at all. I have no involvement in this. Yes, there were 4 art students from my school in the encampment. They were quite active in the encampment, but I had nothing to do with this. And this is a kind of sort of stranger to me, someone who I know from a neighborhood, who knows a friend, who is I think Jewish, but not particularly religious, or, you know, and so there's a very deeply strange alliance happening here around an identification that usually was not so present in the public sphere, was not something that was spoken of necessarily, but that is being used to kind of name and shame certain people, and somehow being maybe associated with certain Palestinian solidarity, or maybe having made a few posts. I was accused of instantiating partly the encampment, and this was quite frightening to me in some ways. It spoke about networks of gossip and networks of kind of informal networks of information being passed and changing hands, and in that, in fact, the very meaning of the information losing its original message. So something quite interesting. Perhaps to end with there, and I see we don't have any more questions, and Tirdad is very kindly advertising the next session. Thank you so much, Tirdad, for initiating this conversation. I kind of missed seeing you tonight on the screen, but thanks for sharing the link to the next discussion, which is Palestine and German fragility, with a Sami Khatib and Tirdad Zolgader. So not to be missed, and what is becoming a really interesting series. We have recorded this. We will potentially be doing something with these recordings at a later stage. But great. Thank you to Noor, thank you to Ulrike, and thank you so much to Joe in Cape Town, and to this lovely audience here at SWAP with us today, who have been a little bit quiet maybe, but really good to have you here in the room. All right. Thank you so much, and excuse me for my awkward hosting and technical faults. It's sort of part of my charm, I think. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.